Every once in a while, you're going to come across a passage that begins with a conjunction, in this case, for, in Matthew 21, and you're going to say, how on earth is this to be translated? How does this story connect to the preceding, or does it? I have to admit, I'm a little bit perplexed on what to do with the gar in Matthew 21. It doesn't quite make sense, and there's no entry in BDAG that corresponds to what's going on in Matthew 21. Let me explain it. All the translations do translate the gar as for the kingdom of heaven is like an owner of the estate who went out early in the morning. And this is the story of the owner paying people the same amount of money regardless of when they start working in his fields. And you notice it's the beginning of a paragraph. I know it's a modern invention, but it is the beginning of a paragraph. And when we hear for, in English, we hear cause, don't we? In other words, you hear for, you're expecting to hear the reason or the cause for a previous action. And the problem is the preceding story is really different. The preceding story is the story of the rich man, the rich young ruler. Harder for a rich man to get into heaven than for a camel to go through the eye of a needle. And Peter says, well, we've lost everything. And Jesus says, you'll get your rewards. And then in chapter 20, he tells the story of the generous employer. And you go, well, how is Matthew 20 the reason for the story in Matthew 19? And the part of the answer is it's not. It's not the reason. And I was inclined to think, well, shouldn't even be translated, until I noticed that how does the previous story end? The many will be first who were last, and the last who were first. Okay, this is the ending of the story of the rich young ruler. When you go to the end of the story of the generous employer, you have the same conclusion. So the last will be first and the first will be last. Okay, you go, okay, that means these stories have to be connected in some way. But again, the problem is that this story is not the reason for the preceding story. It's more it's another story that's making the same point until you realize, and this is all coming out of the gar, it all comes down to the fact that Jesus is going to be generous towards his disciples. He's going to be generous towards those who are last in this world by making them first in his kingdom, just like the generous employer was generous to all of his workers regardless of when they started work for him. Same conclusion on both stories. For the first will be last and the last will be first. So at first glance, I just said gar shouldn't be translated until I realized that it is telling us that Matthew 20 is related to Matthew 19. Now, it's not related in the sense of cause. Okay, that's not what's going on. And when you scroll through BDAG, you get down to number 2, and gar can be a marker of clarification. For you see, it's not really what's going on in Matthew 20, but when you get down to the third, it's a marker of inference, certainly by all means, so then. Well, to choose between those three, you're going to go with the marker of clarification. But the point is, there is a gar there. Sometimes gar just indicates continuation. But before you don't translate an initial conjunction, look at the larger context. Both stories end on the same note, and both stories are talking about a generous God, a God who rewards his disciples, a God who rewards the last by making them first, and a God who generously rewards all of his children regardless of when they began to work for him. So I must say, I started this blog by thinking I'm going to leave, this is the place where gar can't be translated, but upon further reflection, it does.